r/nosleep. Posted by u/ill_caterpillar 544. My grandmother told me someone was in the house. Part 1. I spend most of my waking hours caring for my elderly grandmother, who suffers from Alzheimer's disease, which has taken increasingly more and more from her. The daily routine is pretty simple. I get her out of bed, and after a series of mundane tasks, I sit her on the couch, where I read to her or throw on a movie from before I was born. Throw in a few naps and meals throughout the day, and that's about it. I don't do anything requiring advanced medical knowledge. A nurse comes by the house twice a week to help with that sort of stuff. I have zero medical training other than a CPR course I took a few months ago in case of an emergency, though I haven't had to use my new life-saving skill yet, and something tells me that I am already forgetting the basics with each passing day. With any luck, I won't ever need it, but luck isn't something in high supply for us lately. Some people find it sad, and even a little odd, that I, a 23-year-old college dropout, am spending my youth caring for my grandmother instead of finding a job or building a life for myself. To be honest, I don't mind it. My grandma took me in when I was 11 years old after my father and mother split. Neither of them really wanted a child. That was evident from the beginning. I think my mother loved me, but she was never fit to raise a child, and she knew it. My father, on the other hand, was never fit to be around children, let alone take care of one himself. He was always in and out of jail. Before my grandmother took me in, my fondest childhood memories were when my dad was doing time. Things weren't so bad when it was just my mother and me. But whenever he returned from his imprisonment, things would always end up falling apart again. It wasn't a stable place for a family, if you could call us that. When my parents finally did divorce, I was about as dejected and somber as a child could be. The bright beam of childhood innocence had long since faded from my eyes. That all changed when I went to live with my grandma. Her house was clean and big, and had an acre of land. I had a room to myself and more than 2 changes of clothes. I thought we must have been rich. As an adult, I know that rich is not really the word for my grandmother. Yes, she bought a large home in the 60s but never saved any money. My grandfather passed away before I was born, but from what I hear, he was a great man and an adoring husband to my grandmother. He worked as a teacher and did some odd jobs for friends to bring in extra cash. My grandmother never worked but raised my mom, which was work enough. When my grandpa died, my grandmother was given a decent chunk of change from his life insurance and lived off of that, her disability check, and social security. Raising me increased her financial burden, but she never let it show on her face. That woman always had a smile on. I wish that smile would come back. Ever since the disease started taking a firm hold on her, she mostly just stares. She speaks, but not enough to have entire conversations. If she has something to say, she says it, and I do my best to respond even if I am unsure what she means. On the other hand, I try to talk to her as much as possible. I'm just so afraid of her feeling alone. It must be such an isolated feeling for your mind to slip away. She allows me to take care of her on the good days, and we spend quality time enjoying novels and her black and white TV shows. On the bad days, she won't let me help at all. I don't quite understand what sets her off, but some days she wakes up paranoid and scared. See, that is why I am writing this. We haven't had a good day in a week. And some weird things are happening. Not just the usual weird. Something is off about the house, my grandma, and maybe me. I've changed my name as well as the names of others because I'm somewhat private and don't want people close to me to know all the details. Day 1, Sunday. My alarm went off at 5:55 a.m. What the hell? I thought. I always set my alarm for 9 a.m. Although many old people enjoy waking up earlier than the sun, my grandma will sleep all day if I let her. I usually start my day at 9 o'clock, get myself ready, make breakfast, and then get grandma out of bed around 10 o'clock or 10:30. So why was my alarm going off at 5:55? I turned it off and rolled over, trying to fall back asleep. But before I could, I heard a crash from upstairs. I live in the basement, and grandma lives in the master bedroom on the main floor. I rushed out of my room and up the stairs as quickly as possible. Was grandma hurt? Did she fall? What was she doing out of bed? My mind was racing. When I reached the top of the stairs, I expected to see my grandmother somewhere on the floor, but instead, I saw an empty living room. The lights were still off, and the sun hadn't come up yet, making the room barely visible. I peered into the master bedroom and found grandma still fast asleep. I closed the door slowly, trying not to wake her. With grandma safe in her room, I decided to check the house to see if I could locate the source of the crashing sound. The kitchen looked normal, Except for a knife in the sink, which I was pretty sure I had cleaned and put away the night before, but I brushed it off, figuring I had just forgotten the one utensil when doing the dishes. Next, I checked the living room and found a book on the floor. I keep the house pretty tidy so the grandma doesn't trip over anything, so it was definitely odd to find the book in the middle of the room. I picked it up and opened it. It was a scrapbook. It was one of the many my grandmother had put together over the years. This one mainly consisted of photos of my grandparents and a few of my mother when she was young. Closing the book, I walked a few feet to the bookshelf and returned it, where dust had revealed its usual resting place. I still felt a little groggy, and with my tired mind, I rationalized that my grandma had been looking at the book earlier and left it on the floor without me realizing it. I keep a close eye on her most days, but hey, everyone slips up sometimes. That's the thing about the human mind. We will do anything to rationalize the unexplainable. It wasn't until the next day that I genuinely suspected something was wrong. Remembering it was still early and I had about 3 hours before I needed to get on with my day, I snuck out of the house for a quick run. I don't typically leave my grandmother unattended, but she wouldn't wake up for a while, and it was nice to get some time to myself. I returned to the house half an hour later and took a shower. Stepping out of the bathroom, I got a text from my girlfriend, Jane. She works at a bakery and always texts me when she heads off to work, though I usually don't reply for a couple of hours because, like I said before, I'm never up this early. The text read, "Good morning, Paul. I'm going to work, but maybe I can swing by later and hang out for a bit?" I smiled and decided I'd surprise her by texting back immediately, "Have fun at work. I love you. Wow. You're up early." She replied, "Yeah, I got woken up by a loud noise and decided to get a jump start on my day." I left out the part about my alarm going off 3 hours early. Once I had finished getting ready for the day, I tended to the lawn and watched some YouTube videos. When it was time to wake up Grandma, I went into her bedroom softly and turned on the light, but to my surprise, Grandma was already awake. She sat at the foot of her bed staring at me, not with her usual blank stare, but a fearful and almost angry one. "Hey, Grandma, what's wrong?" I tried to make my tone as sincere as I felt. Alzheimer's can change the brain in a lot of ways, but my grandmother could always pick up on my tone, and that hadn't changed a bit. She didn't reply. She just kept staring at me. I decided to give her some privacy after making sure she was safe. I walked out as I said, "I'll just be in the living room, okay? You let me know when you are ready to come out." The doctor told me that eventually, her mind would be so faded that I would have to start taking charge of her routine whether she gave me verbal cues like I'm ready or not. But I didn't want to believe we had reached that point, so I let her spend some time alone in her room, hoping she would appreciate the personal space. I went to the kitchen to make some breakfast. As I glanced into the sink, ready to wash the knife I had forgotten about the night before, it was gone. That was weird. But being the eternal rationalist that I am, I figured I was tired when I noticed it earlier and was probably mistaken. There is a window above the kitchen sink, which gave a beautiful view of the lawn I had just mowed. As I admired my hard work, a bluebird flew by and rested on the back porch. I'm no bird watcher, but I couldn't deny that this beautiful bird looked almost out of place in our little backyard. I had never seen a bird like it in our area. When I turned around, I almost jumped out of my skin to see my grandmother an inch from my face. "Geez, Grandma." My fear quickly turned to laughter as I chuckled, "Granny, you nearly scared me half to death. Are you feeling any better?" She still had that scared and angry look on her face. It was almost as if, "Hey, Grandma," I said nervously. "You know who I am, right? It's me, Paul. Your grandson." Quietly, she said without taking her eyes off me, "There's someone in the house." A feeling of awful guilt spread over me as I told her, "No, Grandma, you know me. I live here with you, remember?" Her anger turned to disappointment. She leaned closer to my face and, in a hushed tone, whispered, "No, Paul. I know who you are. I am telling you that there is someone in our house." My heart sank, and the guilty pit in my stomach became a sinkhole of fear. "Where? Grandma, where did you see this person? My God, are they still here?" I instantly believed her, as I always have, but then, for a moment, I thought, is this the disease? Is she seeing things now? I don't remember the doctor saying anything about hallucinations. I pushed the thoughts out of my head. Whether she had imagined it or not, a possible break-in is not something to take lightly. I reached for my phone to dial 911, but my grandmother put her hand on mine before I could unlock it. "He's in my room," she said it almost as if it was an afterthought. My heart raced, and without thinking, I picked her up and shuffled towards the front door. Once outside, I sat her on the porch bench. "Stay here," I said. She wasn't looking me in the eyes. Instincts took over as I rushed back into the house. I ran up to her bedroom. The door was shut. I went to reach for the handle, but I stopped. Adrenaline had gotten me this far, but it seemed to run dry when it came time to investigate. I'm not a big man, nor am I trained in any form of self-defense. What would I even do if I found someone in there? I thought. But I needed to make sure that we were safe. I slowly turned the knob and pushed my way inside. Everything looked normal, other than a bit of clutter. Hadn't I picked up her room the night before? I checked under her bed and in the closet, but there was no sign that anyone had been there. I felt relieved and almost smiled at how worked up I'd been. That feeling soon left me as I remembered the master bathroom with its door still shut. With my last bit of courage, I flung the door open, but what I saw didn't scare me. Actually, it was really confusing. The walls, the mirror, the floor, all of it. It was all covered in a black sludge. The smell reminded me of the many hot summer days I spent walking the empty road as a kid. It was the smell of tar. "What the hell?" I said audibly. After standing in shock for what must have been 5 minutes, I checked the rest of the house but found nothing. I walked outside to find Grandma still on the bench. Her attention had turned to a small pile of ants on the concrete. "Hey, Grandma, I checked the house. There's no one there." She didn't reply. "Did something happen in the bathroom? Where did you even get the tar?" Still no reply. I wasn't totally convinced that there had been an intruder, but I also wasn't totally convinced my grandma had made the mess herself. Sure, she had trouble with basic household tasks and could have gotten confused, but where did the tar come from? The rest of the day passed by pretty quickly. Grandma hadn't said a word to me since the incident, but honestly, I didn't really have time for conversation anyway. Cleaning the tar was nearly impossible. It took me well into the afternoon to clear away the black stain. The tar was warm to the touch initially but soon completely dried, making it hard and resistant to my efforts. I resorted to scraping it off with a putty knife. I didn't even realize what time it was when I heard a knock at the door. Jane. I ran to the door and opened it to see her face beaming at me. She was obviously relieved to be off work and ready to enjoy a night in with my grandmother and me. I, on the other hand, was a sweaty mess from clearing the tar. "Jane. I am so sorry I lost track of time and forgot you were coming over." She looked disappointed and said, "Oh, sorry. Do you want me to leave? I should have texted to remind you I was coming." "No. Please come in. I'm sorry. I just feel bad that I haven't showered or made dinner or anything. I've been so busy today. You won't believe what happened this morning." She stepped in and said, "Can't wait to hear all about it." She always sounded so cheerful. It was one of the things I loved most about her. "How's Grandma doing?" she asked. It's been a bad day for her today. She knew what I meant. I had often confided in her about Grandma's previous bad days. She knew from interacting with Grandma how quiet and off she could seem when her mind wasn't at its best. "Aw, Granny," she said, turning a sympathetic face to Grandma. She really did love my grandma. We ordered Chinese food, and I told Jane about the day's events. "That's so weird," she said between bites of orange chicken. "Where do you think she got the tar?" "I don't know. I'm not even 100% sure it was her. I mean, who knows, maybe someone was in our house. I did notice a few things out of place, but it doesn't seem like we've been robbed." We sat silently for a few seconds. The tar was a mystery to both of us, but we turned our attention to the black and white film we had put on for Grandma, and soon, the night started to feel like any other. When the movie ended, I tucked Grandma into bed. Jane and I turned on a show with actual color and fell asleep cuddling on the couch. Day 2, Monday. My alarm woke me up at 5:55 a.m. I looked at my phone, puzzled that it had happened twice. Before I had time to go back to bed, a loud bang from upstairs startled me. I was on my feet in an instant. This sound was much louder than the one the day before. I barreled up the stairs and peered into Grandma's room. She was asleep. Stepping back into the living room, I found the same scrapbook on the floor. I was thoroughly freaked out at this point and started turning on all the lights. Once the room was well lit, I opened the scrapbook. A sinister feeling crept into my bones as I flipped through page after page. Every picture that included my mother had been ruined, her face cut from each photo. I called the police, and the operator said they would be there as soon as possible. I was convinced that there had been someone in the house. While waiting for the police, I woke up Grandma and walked her out to my car, where she sat while I looked the house over. In the 6 minutes it took for the police to arrive, I noticed a drawer open in the kitchen, the one where we keep Ziploc bags, tin foil, and saran wrap. I also found more black tar in the bathroom, as well as in the garage. The police walked through the house, checking every possible place a person could hide. They told me they didn't find anyone and that there was no evidence of forced entry. Sounds like someone might be looking to hurt your mom, seeing as her face was cut out of all the pictures, said the older-looking officer. Well, if someone had it out for her, they had the wrong house. We haven't seen her in nearly 10 years. I replied. The officers offered to check up on us later tonight to make sure there wasn't anyone lurking around the property and said to call again if there were any further disturbances. They didn't even acknowledge the tar everywhere, which was frustrating, but they probably couldn't make any more sense of it than I could. Thanks, officers, I said. I ushered Grandma back into the house as they pulled out of the driveway. Throughout the whole ordeal, she had been absolutely silent. You all right, Grandma? I asked. No response. We stepped into the living room, and I was helping her sit on the couch when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. I turned to face the kitchen window. That same bluebird from the day before was staring right at me. The bird was so beautiful, but looking at it, I couldn't help but feel like I was in some sort of danger. It continued to stare for a few moments and then flew away. The day dragged on. Grandma hadn't said a word. Worse, she hadn't even looked me in the eyes. I was worried for her but tried to talk to her as if everything was fine. I didn't want her any more upset than she seemed to be already. Communication can be so difficult when our loved ones get old. The sun dipped over the horizon, and suddenly, it was night. Jane had asked to come over, but I turned her down. I was starting to feel in over my head, and I didn't want to dump my baggage on her. Finally, it was time to put grandmother to bed. As I helped her get comfortable, she looked at me. It was a welcome surprise, and I smiled at her, but she didn't smile back. She only whispered the words, "Someone is in the kitchen." Ice went down my spine. What? Grandma, we were both just in there, and I didn't see anybody. She looked terrified. Obviously, my words were of no comfort to her. She just repeated again, "In the kitchen, the kitchen, kitchen." Then she rolled over, closed her eyes, and stopped speaking. She was really starting to make me worried, and I really couldn't decide whether to believe her or not. I left the room and headed for the kitchen. Upon arrival, I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary right away. Other than the drawer with the bags and wrap, it was open again. I turned to walk out and turn the light off, but the room didn't get dark. I flicked the switch on and off, but the room remained illuminated. In fact, it was getting brighter. Panicked, I did the first thing that came to my mind and reached for the big knife in the knife block, but I froze when I noticed the knife block was empty. Sweat washed over me, and I saw the knives in the sink. The room continued to illuminate brighter and brighter as I dashed for a knife and cut myself on one of the smaller blades before finally grabbing hold of the bread knife. My attention briefly turned to my bloody hand as I attempted to wrap a rag around the wound. Just then, the room went completely quiet, and I saw it. A large figure, maybe 8 feet tall. The creature was completely naked except for a plastic film, saran wrap, covering it from head to toe. The light emanating from the figure seemed to give me tunnel vision, blurring my surroundings. I couldn't make out the face, as it was completely masked in the plastic wrapping, but there was a protrusion where the nose was underneath. Petrified, I felt my blood run cold. I always thought of myself as brave, but at this moment, I was so scared that I was physically unable to move. The dread filled me like molasses in a glass, slowing my thoughts. I dropped the knife, which crashed to the tile floor with a metallic clang. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like stone. I stared in horror at the bright monster, and just when I thought it might attack, it began to speak. "Fear not, sweet boy." Its voice sounded frail and weak as if trying to convince me I was safe. It reminded me how an old person might talk to a child, almost mimicking their innocent tone. It continued to speak, "Sweet Paul. Sweet Paul. Who are you?" I managed to say in a shaky voice. "Sweet Paul, I am your guardian angel. Your guide in the darkness. Your friend from above." I wasn't convinced. An angel? This thing looked demonic. It was the stuff of my nightmares. Okay, well, I'm good, actually. I don't need a guardian angel. The angel began breathing heavily, and in a much deeper voice than before, it said, "Yes, my sweet boy. You do." Just then, the knives in the sink flew straight up in the air and stuck into the ceiling. The noise startled me, and I turned to see the knives dangling. With my eyes briefly off the creature, I immediately heard footsteps running toward me. I screamed and turned back to face the monster. Raising my arms to shield my face, I braced for impact, but it never came. I opened my eyes to a dark, empty room. It was gone. and I was all alone. I quickly flipped on the light and grabbed my phone to call Jane. It went straight to voicemail. She must be asleep, I thought. With no one to talk to, I paced around my room until exhaustion took its toll, and I went to bed. There's so much more that I want to share about this week, but I am a little busy dealing with the fallout, and I'm mentally exhausted. I'll try to post soon about the rest. Until then, I'll leave you with some advice. When your elderly grandmother tells you there's someone in the house, believe them. Posted by you/il_caterpillar 544. My grandmother told me someone was in the house. Part 2. Sorry to leave you in the dark. After posting part 1, I realized that typing this week's events from hell was very exhausting. But I need to get this out there. People need to know about what happened. It's what my grandmother would have wanted. If you haven't read about the events of Sunday and Monday, I highly recommend starting there before continuing. Day 3, Tuesday. The next day, my alarm went off at 5:55 a.m. This time, I was ready. I bolted up the stairs before any noise alerted me to action, hoping to catch the creature who had been terrorizing us. Like always, I started my investigation by checking on Grandma. Asleep. Good, I thought as I shut the door and turned my attention to the rest of the house. I first noticed the scrapbook on the floor, with its pages torn out and strewn across the floor. I expected to find the book there, but something about the ripped pages felt sinister and menacing. I needed to clean that up before my grandmother had a chance to see the pitiful state of her treasured photo album, but that would have to wait until I scoured the rest of the house. Next, I went to the kitchen. Nothing looked too out of the ordinary, but I noticed that one knife remained stuck to the ceiling while the rest had fallen to the ground. I was about to check the rest of the house when I heard a loud slam coming from the basement. It's messing with me, I thought. The noise was louder than the previous days, and I was sure it had woken Grandma, so I decided to check on her again before investigating. Just as I suspected, Grandma was sitting upright when I walked through the door. She hadn't turned to look at me when I walked in. "You okay, Grandma?" I asked. I wasn't expecting a response since she had been nearly mute the past few days. Despite my expectations, she answered immediately. "It's okay, Paul. They can't hurt us today. Jay will protect us." Jay was the name of my grandfather, who had been dead for over 20 years. I didn't have the heart to remind her of his passing, so I said nothing and walked towards the stairs. As I took the first step down, the loud banging noise repeated, sending a chill down my spine. I went to take the next step but stood frozen for several seconds. I managed to break through my terror and continue my plunge to the basement. Other than my room, there are 2 other rooms downstairs. A guest bedroom and a family room, which had slowly morphed into my personal man cave over the years. The sound happened a third time, and it was clearly coming from the family room. I peeked my head through the doorway but quickly shot back behind the wall. I had expected to see my not-so-angelic guardian angel, but crouched in the middle of the room was something far, far worse. It was bigger than the angel, maybe 8 or 9 feet tall. Instead of light, the creature emanated a blinding darkness, which seemed to be battling for space with the moon's soft light coming through the window. Its hands were disproportionately large for its body, with long bony fingers. But the most notable characteristic of the monster was what was covering its body. From head to toe, the creature was soaked in hot black tar, which dripped down to the floor. The chemical smell was overwhelmingly potent, and I found myself struggling not to gag as I sat still and listened to the beast breathe. Curiosity got the better of me, and I shifted my weight, preparing to take another look. Before I could peer around the corner, the monster screamed, which sounded like the mix of a man and a dog. I booked it to the staircase, looking back, only to watch as the creature tumbled behind me with impressive speed. I reached the top of the stairs and almost ran for the front door when I remembered Grandma, who was still in her room. Thinking quickly, I leapt behind the island counter in the middle of the kitchen and hid myself, trying to make as little sound as I could. I heard the tar monster reach the top of the stairs and pause. Thankfully, it didn't know where I was, but soon began searching for me. I caught a glimpse of it as its back was turned to me, and I noticed it was carrying something large. "Is that a rug?" I thought to myself. Then I recognized it. The thing was carrying the rug from underneath my coffee table. What on earth does it want with that? I turned my attention back to my hiding place and scanned for a weapon. As my eyes darted around the kitchen, I became transfixed on the window, or rather what was behind the window. A little bluebird. Just then, I heard something crash against the floor, and I spun around. The creature was gone, and my rug lay rolled up in the living room. The rest of the day felt foggy. My head was aching, and no amount of acetaminophen could dull the throbbing. Grandma stayed in her room, not letting me in other than to bring her meals and make sure she was taking her medication. By the time night rolled around, I was ready to call it a day, but Jane came over for dinner, and her contagious, unending energy started to rub off on me. "So what did you do today? Find any more objects in weird places?" she asked innocently. I had almost forgotten that I hadn't told her about the bizarre monsters I'd been seeing. I thought about keeping it to myself, but I could never lie to her. We had been friends since elementary school and together since high school. She was the one person on earth I expected to believe my story. So I told her about the tar monster and the plastic angel from the night before. When I finished, she stared at me with her jaw open. "Oh my goodness, Paul, this is just like that show Ghost Adventure or something." She had a huge smile on her face, which was not the reaction I was expecting. Maybe not exactly like Ghost Adventures, but it is pretty freaky," I said. "We should set up some cameras and catch them the next time they appear. We could be famous or something." She really did seem genuinely excited about the idea. "I'd like to see how excited you are when they appear in your kitchen," I shot back, now smiling myself. "It's okay, Paul, I'll stay the night to protect you," she offered. "Don't you work in the morning?" I asked. "Nope. We're closed tomorrow, silly. You know how my boss is, always closing the place down whenever she goes out of town. She still doesn't trust any of us to make the cinnamon rolls the right way. Anyways, she's going to Disneyland with her new boyfriend, so I have the day off." I didn't say it, but I was extremely relieved not to spend the night alone. I was starting to get seriously terrified of my own home. "Well, it's settled then," I told her. "You can deal with the big evil monsters, and I will get some much needed beauty sleep." The rest of the night actually felt pretty normal. We watched a horror movie at Jane's request, what is it with her and this spooky shit? And went to bed. I had this really weird dream that night about my mom. In the dream, I was young, maybe 7 or 8, and was helping her mop the kitchen. She showed me how to fill the bucket with water and how much cleaner to pour in. She handed me the mop and said, "Give it a try." I was so eager to help I nearly tripped over the mop as I swished it from side to side. We were cleaning up something wet, and I figured maybe I had spilled some grape soda again. "And then you dip it back into the water," she told me. I plunged the mop into the bucket and was about to pull it back out when I saw the water turn a light red color. Confused, I looked at the ground I had just mopped and was horrified to see that the liquid I had been smearing around the tile was a thick, shimmering pool of blood. I screamed and looked up at my mother for her to comfort me, but I stumbled backward over the bucket when I saw her. As I lay soaked in soap, water, and blood, I watched my mom stare at me with the biggest smile. Her head was bleeding. I shot up in bed, free from the nightmare. I must have been gasping for air because Jane sat up as well and started rubbing my back. Hey, what's the matter?" she asked. Catching my breath, I said, "I just had the weirdest, most morbid dream of my life. I was a kid, and my mom was letting me help with chores, but she was bleeding everywhere, and I think she was dying." Jane continued to comfort me and said, "That is weird. Your mom is fine, though, right? I mean, as far as we know?" To be honest, I wasn't sure how my mom was doing. The last time I saw her was just before she went to rehab. From that time forward, I only communicated with her through letters. When I was 13, the letters stopped. "I'm sure she's okay," I said, more to reassure myself than Jane. We went back to sleep, and I didn't have any more dreams that night. Day 4, Wednesday. My alarm woke Jane and me up at 5:55 a.m. "Why did you set the alarm so early?" she asked, pulling a pillow over her ears. I turned off the alarm. "I didn't set it. It's just been doing that. There should be a loud sound, kind of like banging, in a minute or two." We sat in complete silence, waiting for something to happen. About 10 minutes passed, and I started to feel relieved. "Maybe nothing will happen today," I said. Moments later, we heard a scream coming from upstairs. "Granny!" Jane shouted as the two of us sprang into action. I stumbled on the stairs but recovered quickly as I bear crawled the rest of my way up with tremendous speed. When I reached Grandma's door, Jane was close behind me. I burst through the door and looked side to side for my grandmother. She was gone. I ran to her bed and checked underneath, but there was nothing. We searched everywhere, the closet, the bathroom, the kitchen. Everywhere. She had just vanished. "Call the police, I'm gonna drive around the neighborhood in case she left the house." Jane began dialing 911, and I heard her give the operator the address as I left the house. I spent the next 15 minutes driving up and down the roads close to home, but there was no sign of my grandma. Jane texted me that the police had arrived, and I returned to the house. The police rechecked the home and talked to someone on their radio about having all officers on the lookout for a wandering and confused elderly woman. I explained to them that her scream sounded frightened and that I thought she might have been taken. They listened to me explain as much as I could without making me sound crazy, and when I had finished my story, they told me the most likely scenario was that she had left the house on her own. I didn't try to argue. I knew how my story must have sounded, and there was nothing I could say to get them to believe me. On top of that, I wanted them to be correct. If Grandma were out on her own, as dangerous as that would be, it would be better than being taken. The officers left the house to search for Grandma. While they drove away, I held Jane, who was sobbing, into my shirt. Jane and I drove around town the rest of the day looking for her. When we were tired of driving, we returned to the house and searched again. We repeated this cycle until it started to get dark, and we decided to try again the next day and allow the police to do their jobs. We remained in contact with them throughout the day, but their search had turned up nothing. I was devastated and felt like crying, but I held back the tears all day. I was not afraid to cry in front of Jane, but I felt like I needed all my energy to go toward finding Grandma. I couldn't waste any time crying. While at home, Jane passed out on the couch, exhausted from the emotionally taxing day. I stayed up on my computer creating a flyer to put up around town the next day. I kept my phone ringer on so I wouldn't miss any updates from the police. Eventually, I started to drift off while sitting upright in my chair. I felt the world getting fuzzy as my eyelids slowly fell, fluttering back open a few times and falling again. I was seconds away from succumbing to full unconsciousness when I heard a voice whisper, "You don't remember, do you, sweet boy?" I jolted awake to find the plastic angel peering its head from behind the sofa that Jane was sleeping on. Its long fingers wrapped around the back of the couch. Jane. I managed to squeak out. "Jane, wake up." She didn't move. I knew she was a deep sleeper, but come on, Jane. You need to remember. The angel's voice was shrill, like nails on a chalkboard. "Remember what?" I asked. "You need to remember, Paul. You were young. Your mind was easily molded." But it was not the truth. The angel began inching toward me as it continued. "You need to see what you were forced to forget." When the angel had reached my chair, it slowly lifted its pointer finger, which began to glow brighter than any light I had ever seen. The finger landed on my forehead, and I fell into deep sleep. 15 years ago, a forgotten memory. When I was 8, my parents fought a lot. One summer, when my father finished his third stint in prison, he returned home to find that my mother was not conducting their finances the way she had before he went away. She spent more money on groceries and less on pills. She bought me new shoes and even took me to the movies once. This caused them to fight to no end. Whenever they would argue, I would sit outside our mobile home on a concrete slab and wait for it to be over. One day, I sat out in the sweltering sun and played with a group of ants that found a small splash of grape soda I had spilled. I let them crawl on my fingers and then back to the hot ground. The air was wet and thick, making the heat hard to swallow. Each breath drew in almost as much moisture as air. The yelling from inside became unbearably loud, so I stood up and began walking. I didn't know where I was walking to. I just wanted to be somewhere safe. After about a half-mile of wandering aimlessly, I saw a girl sitting on a tire swing hanging from a solitary tree. I tried not to make eye contact because I was 8, and girls were icky. As I was walking past, she called out to me, "Hey, kid." Shocked, I turned to see her with a warm smile on her face from ear to ear. "Hi," I replied sheepishly. "Could you push me? I'm not very good at pumping my legs." I felt a little weird about it, but I didn't really have anything else to do. I decided to comply since pushing a girl on a swing seemed more interesting than walking. "What's your name?" she asked. "Paul," I said, warming up to her more and more by the minute. "What's your name?" I asked. "Jane," she said matter-of-factly. We played for around an hour, and I decided it was probably time to head back home. My parents didn't like when I was gone for long. After that day, every time my parents would fight, I'd walk over to Jane's house, and we'd push each other on the old tire swing. On one particularly rainy day, my parents got into another one of their heated arguments. I put on my rain boots and was about to go to my room to get my coat, hoping to meet up with Jane. Maybe we could find some big puddles to splash in, I thought. As I trotted over to my bedroom, I heard my mother scream. It wasn't a scream of anger, that wouldn't have been novel enough to catch my attention. It was a scream of pain. I ran into the kitchen, where I saw my mother holding her face, which was quickly turning a dark color. My father was standing over her with rage in his eyes. Fear held me in its grasp. I wanted to turn, to run. But the fear held me in place, staring at the violent scene before me. Wide eyes filling with tears, I looked at my mother, then at my father, and back at my mother. My dad looked at me and shouted, "You see, Paul? This is what happens when you step out of line." I was paralyzed. I wanted to help my mother, tell her that everything would be okay. I wanted to hurt my father for hurting her. But most of all, I wanted to scream. I wanted to scream so badly, but I couldn't. All that came out was a sob. My crying only made my father angrier. He took a step towards me, but my mother shot up off the ground like lightning and lashed at him, screaming, "Stay away from him, you monster." My dad shoved her off and went to hit her again, but my lungs finally released the death grip they had held on my oxygen, and I screamed, "Stop it." This caught him off guard, and as he turned to face me, my mother jumped to her feet once more and rushed to the knife block, pulling out the biggest one. Before she had a chance to use it, my father grabbed her from behind and threw her down. Her head slammed into the counter on her way to the floor. With a thud, she landed on the ground. She lay motionless as a pool of blood formed around her. "Oh shit!" my dad yelled. He started grabbing at her head in a feeble attempt to stop the bleeding. "No, no, no, no." His voice trailed off. As I watched this unfold, my vision became blurry, and my peripheral vision faded out, locking my gaze on the crimson stream flooding from my mother. We sat in silence. Minutes passed, then an hour. I didn't dare say a word. I couldn't. There was nothing in my 8-year-old mind that could understand what had happened. My mother never woke up. When my father finally composed himself, he stood up off the ground and began rummaging through drawers in the kitchen. After a minute of searching, he found what he was looking for. He dropped to his knees next to my mother with a package of saran wrap in his hands. He lifted her head a few inches and carefully wrapped the plastic around her head. He was thorough, making sure the blood couldn't continue to drip from her wound. Once he was satisfied with his patch-up job, my mother looked like a shiny mannequin. He laid her head back down and left the room, returning a moment later with the rug from under our coffee table. He wrapped her tightly, and to my surprise and relief, he never asked me to help. I had to stand up to avoid him as he dragged my mother out of the kitchen and through the front door. He latched the deadbolt behind him, and a moment later, I heard his truck's ignition. Peering out the window, I watched him drive away. He didn't come back for several hours. The whole time he was gone, I stayed in my corner of the kitchen, curled into a ball. When he did return, he walked in slowly. He was sweaty and tired and wore a look of shock on his face. He took a shower, got dressed, and then called me into the living room. I did as I was told and shuffled my little feet until I found myself sitting on the couch beside the man who had raised me. He was quiet for a while and seemed to be lost in thought. Eventually, he looked at me and said, "Polly, you know Mommy had to go away for a little bit, right?" I looked at him, confused. He continued, "Mom has been fighting some tough battles these past few months. She used a lot of drugs. You know she used drugs, don't you?" I nodded. I said nothing as he thought for a minute before telling me, "Mom had to go somewhere to get help. A rehab center. It's kind of like a hospital." The more he spoke, the less I understood. "But she was bleeding. Where did you take her?" I felt more lost than I had ever felt. "No, Paul," he said sternly. "She wasn't bleeding." But you," I stammered. "No. Paul, no," he shouted. "Mom is fine. She just had to go away for a while." He sounded really frustrated. "She had to go away," he reiterated. "So when someone asks you where your mom is, what do you tell them?" He was looking me right in the eyes now. I thought for a minute. "I tell them she had to go away for a while. Yes, Paul, that's right." He buried my face in his chest as he forced an embrace. "That's right, son. Mom just had to go away for a little while, and that's all we know." When he left the room, I sat there a little longer before standing shakily to my feet and walking out the front door. I sat on the wet concrete slab, unsure if I should cry. I was so confused. I really wasn't sure what had happened, but I wanted to believe my father. If he were telling the truth, then Mom would be okay. The rain had stopped, but the clouds still loomed overhead. Just then, I heard a quiet tap on the concrete beside me. I turned my head to see the most beautiful bluebird. I awoke drenched in sweat. I was in the living room chair where I had been before the angel had touched my head. Jane was still curled up on the couch. I pulled out my phone and checked the time. It was 5:50 a.m. My alarm would be going off in 5 minutes. I'll wrap up the events of the week in my next post. Thank you for your support. It feels good to share my story with others who might understand.